The 9 Greatest Battles of Napoleon Bonaparte. At the end of the 18th century, Europe was living through a turbulent period. Revolutions, wars, and economic crises shook the continent, and ancient empires staggered in the face of new ideas. It was in this unstable setting that a young Corsican officer emerged, ambitious, disciplined, and brilliant. Napoleon Bonaparte. Over the course of just over 2 decades, Napoleon fought dozens of battles that completely transformed the map of Europe. Some marked his meteoric rise. Others revealed his military genius. And some, inevitably, foreshadowed his downfall. In this mini-documentary, we will travel through the main battles of this man who changed history, analyzing not only the clashes themselves, but the strategic mind behind them, his decisions, his mistakes, and their consequences. The Siege of Toulon. The rise of a strategist. The year is 1793. The young French Republic faces internal revolts and a foreign coalition. Toulon, one of the main ports of the Mediterranean, rebelled and opened its gates to the British Navy. The French Revolutionary Command sent several officers to retake Toulon, but none managed to break through the defenses. It was then that a young lieutenant colonel of artillery presented a bold plan: to seize strategic hills and use heavy cannons to drive the British out of the harbor. The idea seemed simple, but it required calculation, precision, and courage. Over the course of weeks, Napoleon moved several artillery batteries at night and hid them in trenches, while at the same time developing plans for a coordinated and synchronized attack. When the French finally captured the fortress of Leguillet, the critical position overlooking the port, the British fleet could no longer remain. Toulon was retaken. This was the young officer's first great moment, and a preview of the discipline and audacity that would define his future campaigns. The Battle of Arcole. Leadership that inspires. 3 years later, now commanding the army of Italy, Napoleon faced a far greater enemy, the Austrian Empire. French troops were worn down after long marches. The Austrians held strong defensive positions, and the swampy terrain made any advance difficult. But Napoleon believed that morale decided battles as much as strategy. At the bridge of Arcole, he performed a gesture that would become iconic. He seized a French flag, moved to the front of his troops, and advanced under intense fire, shouting orders and urging the soldiers to follow him. The image of the general carrying the flag would be immortalized in paintings and accounts. The battle was not won at that exact moment, but that act of bravery ignited the French spirit. Arcole was not just a military victory, it was a victory of leadership, demonstrating Napoleon's ability to inspire his men even under the most unfavorable circumstances. The Battle of the Pyramids. Ambition reaches Egypt. In 1798, Napoleon embarked on one of the most unusual campaigns of his career, the invasion of Egypt. More than a military campaign, it was a political and scientific project, to open trade routes, weaken the United Kingdom, and bring scholars to study the ancient civilization. Upon reaching the banks of the Nile, Napoleon encountered the powerful Mamluk cavalry. The Mamluks were skilled, fast, and experienced, but they relied almost exclusively on cavalry charges. Napoleon realized this quickly. Knowing that the French forces were disciplined and well-trained tactically, he ordered his men to adopt square formations, capable of withstanding attacks from any direction. The battle was fierce, and the pyramids stood as millennial witnesses to the clash. With coordinated infantry and artillery fire, the French crushed the Mamluk lines. The victory opened the way to the occupation of Cairo. Napoleon proclaimed that 40 centuries were watching them, a phrase that still echoes today as one of the great moments of military propaganda. Austerlitz. The masterpiece of strategy. At the height of his power, Napoleon faced the combined forces of Russia and Austria in the battle many call his greatest masterpiece, Austerlitz. It was December 1805. All of Europe expected a French defeat, as Napoleon was outnumbered. But he had a plan, a brilliant plan. First, he feigned weakness, deliberately abandoning key positions to lure the enemy in. The hilly terrain around the village of Pratzen seemed decisive. Napoleon allowed the enemy to occupy it, as if he were giving up. When the Austrian and Russian forces advanced too far, their lines became stretched and disorganized. It was exactly what Napoleon was waiting for. At noon, the French launched a devastating attack on the center of the enemy lines, retaking the Pratzen heights and splitting the opposing army in two. At the same time, coordinated assaults struck the flanks, surrounding entire units. The battle ended with more than 25,000 casualties, and an almost total French victory. Austerlitz was not just a military triumph, it was a stunning demonstration of psychology, logistics, manipulation, and perfect timing. Jena and Auerstedt. The collapse of Prussia. In 1806, Prussia, confident in its military past, declared war on France. Napoleon responded with astonishing speed. Rapid marches, enveloping maneuvers, and simultaneous attacks defined his campaign. At Jena, Napoleon faced part of the Prussian army. At Auerstedt, on the same day, Marshal Davout, with much smaller forces, defeated the other half. The Prussians were caught off guard, disorganized, and forced into a panicked retreat. Entire cities and fortresses surrendered without a fight. The Prussian Empire, once a symbol of military discipline, collapsed within weeks. This episode reinforced Napoleon's reputation as a master of maneuver warfare, fast, precise, and relentless. Wagram. The war on a massive scale. The year was 1809. The Austrians tried to challenge Napoleon once again. And the answer came at the immense Battle of Wagram, one of the largest battles ever fought in Europe up to that point. More than 300,000 soldiers were involved in 2 days of intense fighting. The heat was suffocating, dust obscured the horizon, and artillery roared without pause. Napoleon, though victorious, felt the weight of modern warfare. His troops were no longer as disciplined as before. The enemy was learning quickly and copying his tactics. The victory at Wagram solidified his authority, but revealed something troubling. The human cost was becoming unsustainable. War, once maneuvered with elegance, was beginning to turn into a heavy machine, slow and brutal. The Russian campaign. The defeat that was not a battle. In 1812, Napoleon committed what may have been his greatest strategic mistake. He invaded Russia. With the largest army he had ever commanded, around 600,000 men, he advanced deep into Russian territory, expecting a decisive battle. But the Russians, instead of meeting him head-on, adopted a scorched-earth strategy. They retreated, burned their resources, and avoided direct confrontation. The first major battle came only at the gates of Moscow, Borodino. It was a massacre. Although the French won, the victory brought no strategic advantage. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he found the city in flames. Without food, without shelter, and with no prospect of peace, he decided to retreat. That was when one of the most tragic marches in history began. Heavy snow, hunger, disease, and constant attacks would reduce the Grand Army to just a fraction of what it once was. It was not a single battle that defeated Napoleon, but the vastness and cruelty of Russia itself. Leipzig. The Battle of Nations. After the tragedy in Russia, all of Europe turned against Napoleon. In 1813, in the city of Leipzig, he faced a massive coalition: Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and Swedes. It was the largest European battle in history up to that time. For 4 days, a storm of gunpowder, cavalry, and artillery devastated entire fields. Despite brilliant maneuvers, Napoleon no longer had the experienced soldiers of earlier campaigns. His forces were exhausted. When a bridge exploded prematurely during the French retreat, thousands were surrounded and captured. The Battle of Leipzig marked the beginning of the end. Napoleon retreated to France, where he would face his final campaign. Waterloo. The Emperor's Twilight. After the decisive defeat at the Battle of Leipzig, Napoleon saw his empire collapse. Under pressure from the European powers, he abdicated the throne and was sent into exile on the island of Elba. Less than a year later, Napoleon escaped from exile with the support of 1,000 soldiers. Returning to Paris, Bonaparte gained popular and military support and formed a new army. Quickly, the European powers united and formed the Seventh Coalition, determined to defeat Napoleon. The decisive confrontation would take place at Waterloo. On the eve of the battle, heavy rain fell across the battlefield. At dawn, the ground was soaked and muddy, forcing Napoleon to delay the start of the attack. That delay proved crucial. It hindered the movement of French artillery, reduced the effectiveness of the cannons, and gave the enemy time to organize. The French attempted to assault the coalition's strong defensive positions, but failed repeatedly. Then, Napoleon committed the Imperial Guard to the battle. However, Prussian units began to appear on the French right flank. Napoleon was forced to split his forces, including part of the Imperial Guard, to hold back the Prussians. With Bonaparte's army divided, the British seized the opportunity to launch a counterattack against the French. Seeing his troops surrounded and collapsing, the French forces were forced to retreat. By late afternoon, with his army exhausted and encircled, Napoleon realized the battle was lost. After the defeat, Bonaparte abdicated once again and attempted to flee to America, but was captured by the British. This time, he was sent into a far harsher and more distant exile, the island of St. Helena, in the South Atlantic, where he remained until his death in 1821.